You're tuned in to RX Radio.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Another episode of RX Radio. Before we get to it, today's guest, Phil Smith, probably the most requested guest we've had. On a quick note, for those of you who watch the podcast and watch the intro, you'll notice that the intro is recorded in a distinctly different room than the rest of the episodes. If you watched last week's episode, you might be wondering yourself, why did I not move my head the entire intro? And I just sort of had this Stephen Hawking thing going on. I completely fucked my neck up last week, and I couldn't back out of the driveway. So if some of you messaged me and mentioned that, if you didn't pick up on it, go back and watch it because it's ridiculous. My neck works this week. Yay. Out of the gate, paying the bills. Upcoming level 1, level 2. Level 1 is up for sale currently. If you guys haven't had a chance to register, it will be up for the remainder of the month. We'll probably be looking to start in early June, late May, early June. Level 2, if you've already taken level 1 and you're interested in sitting in our next cohort, our next semester of level 2, that will also be starting the same week. So again, late May, early June is the projected start date. If you have any questions, shoot me a message on Instagram, shoot me an email, info@pre-script.com, get you sorted. A few weeks now, I'll be on a plane this time next week, give or take, by the time this airs. If you're in the Greater Toronto area, or if you're not, get on a plane, get to the Greater Toronto area. We're doing an upper body intensive 2-day seminar at Pure Muscle and Fitness. Come just for the gym, honestly. I've trained all over the world. It's definitely one of my favorite places to train, let alone host a seminar. We hosted a lower body intensive there in October. It was great. Good news, breaking news. I don't have everything dotted and signed, but we should have a meal prep company sponsoring the event. Once that breaks, I'll tell you who it is. But yeah, so just show up. We'll supply the food and we'll supply everything else. We're going to have Kyle Baxter, Eric Bagheera, Stu Locke, Killian Hamilton, myself, Jordan Jiunta. Brandon Schultz will also be there. So good times ahead. There's only a handful of tickets still available for that. So quick recap before we get into the episode. L1 tickets, PSL1, 16-week course, up for sale now. L2 also up for sale. L2, you're going to need an invitation to register. We don't just put that out to the general public. If you haven't received it, shoot us an email, shoot us a DM. We'll get you squared away. And then finally, upper intensive at Pure Muscle and Fitness. That will be the weekend of the 14th, 15th of May. So if you're in the Greater Toronto area, or if you're not, get there. A handful of tickets still available. Now, today's episode, Phil Smith. We did an episode with Phil about 18 months ago, live in person in Townsville, Australia. We're doing this one a little different. He's moved down to Newcastle. I'm in Dubai. Jay is in California. And we kind of go, not rapid fire per se, but getting a little bit of insight into Phil's genius around applied nutrition, especially as it pertains to sports performance. So we were able to go deep on a few really contentious topics around nutrition. So we talk about artificial sweeteners. We just talk about psychological parts of diet, and we talk about protein intake. We talk about metabolism, basal metabolic rates, high energy states, low energy states. A really good one to nerd out on, but also a lot of tangible takeaways. What I like about Phil is he teaches in a way that allows you to teach it to an end user, right? So he definitely teaches to coaches very well because he can explain the macro complex topic right down to the micro, but they can also bring the micro back to the macro, so you can actually, no pun intended, actually, right back and bring it to your clients in a way that they understand. So this episode is full of it. Big fan of Phil. Potentially be seeing much more of him in the future. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So yeah, keep an eye out for Phil. Big fan of everything he puts out. So that'll be it, guys. Enjoy the episode. If you like it, I don't know, share it on Instagram, tag Phil. SportPLUS Performance, I believe, is the Instagram handle for Phil, or Big Philly Cheesesteak is the personal account. Feel free to eavesdrop on Phil's goings on. But yeah, that's it for this week, guys. Next week, we're going to have a mystery episode for you. And by mystery, I mean, I don't know what it's going to be because it hasn't been recorded yet. But we'll be back in studio in a few weeks after that. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. And we'll see you guys next week. Hi, friends. Welcome. I'm going to say most requested guest we've had. I'm going to throw that out there into the internet. I guarantee 3 times a week for, I don't know, Phil, how long has it been?
About 18 months, man, to be honest.
year and a half, at least once a week, someone goes, "Hey, when can we get that Big Phil guy back on the podcast?" It's like, well, today's the lucky day. We got the Big Phil guy back on the podcast. Big Phil guy, welcome.
Hey, g'day, gents. How you doing? I definitely think it's probably the longest podcast you've done. It'd be the longest one, wouldn't it? Yeah, it was like an hour and a half, hour and 40.
It was up there, man. It was definitely up there. But you know what it is? It's nutrition is such a it's such a poorly contextualized conversation, and we always have it through the worst mediums possible. Like nutrition on Instagram has started wars. Like it has pitted family against family. Like it's the Capulets and the Montagues out there. And so people are looking for not even definitive information, but I think just looking for context around nutrition. Because weight training, like, oh, do we internally rotate Jiunta at the top of a snatch? I don't know. He said externally rotate, but I was like, that affects like 4 people in the world. 4 people care enough. But everyone eats, and no one knows why or what or how much. So that's why we have Big Phil here.
Glad to be back. Glad I can answer some questions.
Okay, maybe before we get to like the questions that I get fielded about nutrition, which why anyone would ask me, I have no idea. What are the most common things that you get posed?
To be honest, like it's probably the same questions. To be honest, man, it's things like, are carbs bad? How much protein should I have each day? Is protein applicable for this instance or that instance? Can I do endurance athletics on fats, things like that? It's just pretty basic stuff. And also just a lot of it lately around like food quality. So for example, including different types of whole grains, vegetables, fruits, things like that, because we've sort of swayed around the social media conversation. We've swayed from like the legitimate hardcore tracking data type sort of mentality to the intuitive eating type data. But people don't realize that they're actually they're one and the same, in the sense that if you're an intuitive eater, you must have the prerequisite knowledge in order to be intuitive from the tracking that you've once done. And a lot of I suppose the nutritional do-gooders online will tell you, hey, listen, just eat how you feel, just eat intuitively. But if you don't have the prerequisite knowledge, you can't apply that knowledge in the first place.
Right. Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense that you need the knowledge, you need that background learning, that now you can kind of take a step back and not have to monitor every single thing that's going in your mouth, because you can kind of keep a mental inventory of it.
Yeah, and there's some really cool like visual representations. So like so Precision Nutrition is more of a global one. They do a visual method, so palm of protein, cup of carbs, fist of vegetables, thumb of fat, things like that. And they're handy, but again, they're not for any specificity. They're for general health. If a person's trying to improve themselves in performance, improve the body composition, even if they do opt for intuitive eating, they must first have that knowledge in order to do so. So a lot of those questions are coming and forming around that conversation. And, the example was chicken, broccoli, and brown rice, for example, right? So is that applicable long term? Is there benefits to that? Yes, there are. Are there detriments to it as well when it comes to things like our health? So even things like food variety, bloating, discomfort, GI comfort, things like that. All of those questions are becoming more and more prominent because of how, to go back on Jordan's saying, how decisive or divisive, I should say, the internet is becoming with this is the right way and that is the right way.
Do you feel like a lot of the debates are purposefully like gerrymandered to fit a specific outcome in a specific population? I never feel like anyone has the same conversation, right? I never feel like, someone talking about fat loss might be having a different conversation than someone that's talking about weight loss, right? Yeah. I feel like everyone is always just isolating their point to such a specific outcome that people end up arguing back and forth, and they're not actually arguing the same thing.
Constantly. So like, can I give you a really cool example? So like, we know that, so for health, let's talk about health as a whole, right? So we know that exposure to a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains is going to give us the best example. So I use can we have one here? The toy train method. Okay. The toy train method is yes, I have it on my desk. I talk about this a lot. Right? So if we think about a toy train and a toy train track, right? So each sleeper on the toy train track represents a food variety, and that food variety is next to the next one, so on and so forth. The train itself takes up 30 sleepers on the train track. Now, the idea behind food rotation is to move the train along 2 or 3 sleepers each week, but the majority of what you consume stays the same. And that brings in food variety across a long given amount of time. That means that exposure to let's say, some rare melon from the hills of the Himalayas is not going to create a negative effect in the gut if you're exposed to it in 6 months down the track, because you've had a wide variety of food coming through your gut over a duration of time. But if you then flip the conversation and say, listen, what about people who are going for, say, extremely low body fat? Well, in actual fact, having a systematic, almost routine intake of the same foods is going to benefit them, because it actually helps to lower demand, lower hunger response. So if a person's trying to go for extremely low body fats, for example, a physique competition, I would actually put them on 1 or 2 or 3 different vegetables and hold them there for a duration of time, especially if they're not used to actually dieting. If they're not used to dieting, creating too much variety is going to create that hedonistic response, and they're going to try and sort of want bigger varieties in their food. They're going to want more highly palatable foods. Whereas you keep them on the same food for a duration of time, their hunger response is going to come down. Now, that's been researched and established, but in most cases, people these days are saying, listen, hey, that train track analogy, 30 different types of food per week to get the most variety and most exposure to different fiber types in the gut every single week.
Now, I guess to further contextualize that conversation, how would we draw a border around the definition of health? Because I think we're so far afield now that even that is up for debate. What is health in that case? If we're looking at high or an intake of a lot of variability in our diet, and the goal is health, what is health?
From a nutrition point of view?
Yeah.
To be honest, man, it ranges from adequacy and optimal levels of vitamins and minerals and adequate protein and macronutrient intake. So making sure the person isn't just adequate, but optimal. And there is a level there. And I know that word's not sort of pleasantly described on this show typically, but it's important to point out that optimal exists in nutritional instances. And I'll use vitamin D as really as an example. We have 50 nanomole per liter, sort of 75 nanomole per liter will be classified as adequate. Above 75 is optimal. Below 50 to 30 is insufficient, and then below 30 is deficient. So having those ranges do actually exist. So being, the umbrella of health comes into play when you've got different vitamins and minerals applied to different levels to suit, or the lack of disease state is probably the simplest way to put it.
Now, how do we go about assessing that?
To be honest, man, blood tests is the biggest way to do it. That's the most sort of accurate way to doing it. But a lot of it comes back to feel as well. So previously, we talked about vitamin D in the previous episode, and understanding that the different environments and different factors that can determine somebody's need to supplement, for example, or need to expand the nutritional intervention. So a female, for example, will require higher iron levels than a male because of the menstrual bleed. So all of those things, understanding those things can make the biggest win and move forward without any of the need for medical intervention.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I was going to ask too. Is so how common is it that you'll have clients that you'll actually have them take a blood test to determine these things?
Pretty much anyone who's competitive, to be honest, with my clientele. If you're competitive in a sport, I'll typically request you get a blood test. Not all clients do it, to be honest. Not all clients are fans of needles, so we have to work around that. But yeah, as a whole, anyone who's competitive, I'll generally request they get a blood test at some stage. It may not be initially. It may be further in a track, or if they're in an off season, for example, it could be as they come into competition. But generally, yeah, at some point I will.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, that kind of brings me to my next question is, what does eating for performance mean to you?
Adequately fueled is a short answer. Adequately fueled and adequate recovery. So it's sort of a nutshell answer, if that's okay. It's a lot of people tend to sort of only talk about the fueling aspect of nutrition when it comes to performance. So the fueling aspect being, have they got adequate provisions of energy in the form of glycogen, and in some cases in the form of fat stores and fat availability in order to fuel the performance. But we know that performance isn't just it's not just one performance, is it? It's the recovery and the repeatability of what we're trying to achieve. So if you're a person, for example, Jiunta, with your background, obviously things in CrossFit, for example, a lot of the CrossFit events are tournaments, they're weekends across the entire day. You can't just be the fuel for the be for the 20 minutes that you're on the pitch. It has to be for the next 20 minutes, the next 20 minutes, and potentially the next day and the next day, and so on and so forth. Powerlifting, for example, is another one. They have a heavy lift to start with, a heavy lift to second, and a heavy lift to third. So you must have recovery there as well. So how they're recovering between events, how they're recovering between training sessions, how they're maximizing their recovery and their sleep, and the nutrition must be tailored to suit. We know nutrition interferes with sleep. Or sort of affects and interferes with sleep. I should say benefits sleep. It also interferes and affects total energy outside of the actual gym, because a lot of these people who compete in sports, they don't necessarily get paid for it. I mean, it'd be great if we all did, but it's not the case. So making sure that they are functional outside of their chosen activity is also highly beneficial to the individual as well.
Well, I think bringing up sports performance kind of dovetails into a problem that a lot of people struggle with, and that's understanding their own energy expenditure, right? Because I think, the idea of basal metabolic rate is something that might be how someone dips their toe into the pond of understanding energy output on a whole. Because when we start to talk about balances and like the differences between athletics and performance and just general population and health, I think both of the challenges there is trying to figure out, okay, if it's about fuel and recovery, well, how big is the tank? How far do we need to go? What are some sort of like good heuristics around even calculating like total energy expenditure? Because I feel like, the conversation around a caloric deficit is obviously the low hanging fruit in everyone's social media content these days. Right, everyone's just having a dig and just being like, you need to be in a caloric deficit. And I 100% agree, but just yelling that into the internet is not useful.
Yeah.
Figuring out what your energy expenditure is so that you can start to tailor your caloric intake. Because I think whenever I field questions about nutrition, I just go fucking Bill, and I can't get out of it. I go, well, like, you need to figure out how to create a deficit. And I think that's such an overlooked piece, is how do I accurately calculate, or as close to accurate as I can, calculate my total energy expenditure so I know, right? Like, I think of people starting a diet, how much protein do I take, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, calories is probably the most important thing for pretty much anyone looking to make some sort of nutritional intervention. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, actually. The first answer is calories are a unit of energy. That's what they are. We have to determine that straight away, because a lot of people sort of get mixed up with what they are. They're a unit of energy of how much water can, a mil of water can go up per degree, basically. That's what a calorie is from a unit of energy point of view. But how I calculate it depends on the person, to be honest. So for general population, or sort of lower enthusiastically sporting people, or generally use the Harris-Benedict. It tends to be the best mainstream calculation you can use. So it's an online equation. There's thousands of online calculators. I typically use the Omni one because it's the one that's in my internet history, to be honest. But however, there's one called the Mifflin-St. which tends to read a little bit lower. So if you're a person who tends to be a little bit slower, or your clients tend to be a little bit slower in movement or lower in movement, you can use the Mifflin-St. But for athletic populations, without a doubt, I use Cunningham 1980. Now, I have a spreadsheet that calculates that. I don't use an online calculator, but you have to know a fair bit about the client before you can use that one. So you need to know things like steps, counts, body fat percentages. All these things will actually help to determine a much more accurate representation of that individual. But look, regardless of which calculation you actually use, the reality is this. They're equations, they're generalized. So you can't just apply the answer to that calculation to the individual, because, I've got two Jordans on screen right now, and you guys, if you say you're identical in physique, you're identical in outcome, you're identical in sort of goals, the reality is that you'll both be different people. You sleep differently, you move differently. One might take the closer car park at the supermarket, one might take the further car park at the supermarket. So we have to sort of test the waters to see which one suits best. If a person is trying to drop weight, I'll generally start conservatively by going, under the equations results, and then build from there. If they're looking for a weight restricted athletic performance, which is coming soon, so in a close proximity of time, I'll start low as well and build up. Alternatively, if they got more time to play with, I'll start high and build down, because there's always individual nuance between every single person, client to client.
And then the biggest metric we're tracking then obviously is just the scale.
Well, scale and measurements, man, because the scale can be be misleading in the sense that, let's say, for example, a person is going from a higher calorie intake to a lower calorie intake, and they're changing from high density nutrition with, say, like a moderate volume of food. So, for example, they could, let's use a nice easy one. They're using rice, and now we change them to a higher volume food with a lower nutritional density to it. Let's say pumpkin or potato. That could change the amount of fiber that person stores in the gut. Therefore, actual structurally on a scale, their weight won't necessarily move. So we need to look at primary metrics versus secondary metrics versus tertiary metrics, right? So primary metrics obviously are things like scale weight, which I've deemed to be called a semi-objective. Yeah, it's important, but it's not the goal. Measurements are definitely where we want to track. They're objective. They're the one that actually physically moves and tell us the best result. And this is all absence to DEXA scans, obviously, right? This is all just purely what we can do in our office. And then thirdly is the subjective metric of a photograph. So a photograph is probably one of the biggest things. Those three things are one of the things that I track the most. And then from there, we can build out to, if they do want to go and get an in-body scan or a DEXA scan or, bioimpedance scan or whatever they want to do, if that's the case as well. But they can be manipulated too. They're not gold standard by any means. Even DEXAs have a myriad of issues with them.
Is weight loss a common issue that you work with clients? Is that a common problem?
It is, because a lot of my clients are weight restricted. So generally things like powerlifters, weightlifters, they are weight restricted athletes. And even, for example, sports specific, they don't necessarily want to be, hefty people. They want to sort of be a leaner individual, or they associate their leanness with with their performance, which is not always the case. But definitely with weight restricted athletes, you absolutely have to look at the fact that you have to maintain body fat percentage at a certain time. There are people who just drop excessive amounts of weight coming into a competition. Shallow, you're one of those people. You and I have talked about that before in the past. But others, I've got a client now who competes in the 83 class powerlifting. He walks around 83.6. Like that's to the money.
Yeah.
How do you do with
I've definitely competed in weight class regulated sports before, and I've noticed that it's really hard to maintain strength as you drop a weight class. So that's one of the biggest things that I've personally dealt with. Is there any sort of advice that you have towards people that are trying to go through something like that?
Yeah, the biggest one is try and maintain your weight even through training windows. So if you become adapted to your strength parameters during your off season in the weight in which you should be, especially Jordan, with you, obviously you're a 2-hour weigh-in, I believe, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, you want to stay as close as possible. You can start dicking around with things like, sodium hydration status and sort of, fiber concentrations and things like that, which is really good, because if you do start looking at things like low residue nutrition, so coming into an event, you can start to pull fiber. You can pull 1 to 2 kilos or 3 to 4 pounds, I suppose I'd say in the imperial term. You can pull that quite easily. So let's say 74 kilo class, you might walk around at 76 kilos, for example. You can pull that quite easily with a little bit of manipulation, but staying as close to that weight is definitely going to be beneficial long term.
Yeah. How do you deal with plateaus? Because that's always something that's like, from a coaching perspective, is difficult, because, and I'm sure the majority of people listening to this are listening with the intent of taking some of this information and bringing it into whatever practice, whether it's a personal training and they're doing some sort of nutrition consultation, or they're a clinician and this is something that they do more regularly. From a coaching perspective, I'd like to see that actually on both sides, weight gain and weight loss. What are early strategies you can start to deploy to help either push the needle up and start to put on more weight, and for those who are interested in that, or to really kind of drop the hammer and pull weight out? Because the inevitable part of coaching is that everyone's lying to you all the time. So it's like, how is it that you parse between the wheat and the chaff, as it were, and being like, okay, this is a physiological hard stop. People tell me all the time, like, not all the time, and people just stop me in the street like, I'm so overweight, but I eat salads all day. It's like, are you just lying? And like, at some point when you binge, you're getting a caloric surplus that over the course of the week you're actually in a greater surplus than you think, and you just don't eat all day. Like, how do you parse that out, and what are strategies to deploy to gain and lose weight when we kind of hit a plateau?
Yeah, so first got to determine, is the person actually in a plateau is the first thing. So, and going back to the fiber conversation that I said to Jiunta before, that's a real thing, right? If they change from low density, so high density, low volume food to sort of like, sparsely nutrient offering to high volume food, they're going to have a change in the storage in their gut. They just are. That's just the way it's going to happen. Also, the change in hydration status is going to change as well, because obviously water is kept in the muscle alongside glycogen in order to create the hydraulic effect straight away. That hydrolysis happens fast because water's present in order to do that. So that's going to change the status as well. Are they down-regulating their activity? I mean, we have a whole bunch of evolutionary processes that actually allow our bodies to I hate the fucking starvation mode conversation. It's a stupid conversation. But what it does do, we do down-regulate. And I used the car park analogy before, right? So I'm going to just explain that further. If you're in a high energy state, you will just find a car park at the supermarket and you'll park your car and you'll walk the fuck inside. If you're in a low energy state, you will drive your ass around until you find a closed car park close to the door. Now, in both states, you're just finding a car park. Your body doesn't know your brain doesn't consciously know what you're doing. You're just looking for a car park, but it conserves energy to do so. If you need to go for a pee, but you're also thirsty, you're sitting on the couch in a high energy state, you'll get up, go get a drink, come back down. You get up again, go to the bathroom. If you're in low energy state, you'll fucking hold that piss until you're busting and you'll get up and go both in one go. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but over time, a week, a day, a month, so on and so forth, it adds up to overall energy expenditure. You sit stiller, you move slower, you will blink slower. They've measured that. You chew food slower, all of these things to conserve energy. So what's happening in the bigger picture of things that's causing the potential quote unquote plateau? Or is there some sort of downregulation that's occurring as well? Has your food changed, so on and so forth? So we need to address those things. Also, coming back to the whole hunger response, when we go, I mean, let's face it, dieting is a period of, it's basically voluntary famine, isn't it? From an evolutionary point of view, we're going through a period of famine by design, which is ridiculous, but that's how it sort of works. Okay. When that occurs, once again, going back to an evolutionary point of view, our body will then tell us to get the fuck outside and go find food. When the bears come out of hibernation, they don't just sit around going, well, that was nice. Let's sit around and talk about it for a bit. They say, let's go find some food, right? We're not much different. We'll go and find food very rapidly. So if we decide to in our brain that, hey, listen, the famine is over, our brain goes, yep, hunger elevates and we have a need to go and find food. So is that happening on Friday nights without, MyFitnessPal coming out? Is it happening unconsciously? I had a client, do you guys know what the term nuts and bolts is? Do you guys know what that is?
I don't know.
Okay, so nuts and
I
bolts.
don't know in this context.
It could be an Australian thing. Basically, it's cereal. It's breakfast cereal, plain breakfast cereal with like almonds, pistachios, and curry powder mixed together, right? So
and that's nuts and bolts.
It's called nuts and bolts. It's
not.
Yeah.
No, this is just something to see like if white people on the other side of the world actually do it. No one fucking does.
It could be an Australian thing. So I had this client, and basically he wasn't dropping weight. We couldn't figure out what was going on. And same thing, we were just, to be honest, I got to the stage where I was just shaving the ass out of his calories. And it's his garage was parked next to his kitchen. And every single time he walked through his kitchen door, he would subconsciously walk in, grab a handful of these nuts and bolts and put it in his mouth. Now, we're talking about 400 or 500 calories a handful. He was doing that 4 to 6 times a day. So we go into this unconsciousness, right? So we have to be more conscious about our food. So we establish these things that actually occur through the day, and then actually establish whether or not the client's in a true deficit or are they doing something unconscious to their being that's actually occurring to sort of prevent the weight loss. On the flip, then how do I intervene it? Track better, photographs, bring in a 2-stage process. So the 2-stage process would be tracked through an app. It could be Keystone, which is the one I use, for example. It could be MyFitnessPal. It could be a whole series of things, but then also pair that with a photograph as well. So this is really extreme versions, right? So I don't do this to everyone who's just plateaued for a bit, but if they're getting to a point where we can't figure it out, we do a 2-stage tracking method, and that actually helps them identify. We implement things like a lot of my clients themselves are coaches. So one of the things that I do, which is work to treat, is to stop that downregulation of output. Don't let their clients, their gym clients, load bars. Make the coach load bars because they're carrying around surplus plates. So if they do get a downregulation in blinking, chewing, movement in general, we're recouping that by having them load the bars themselves. Even when they're putting the plates away, don't walk to the nearest weight tree, walk to the next weight tree. Little things like that make the biggest difference.
I think the big win is body cameras and check-in photos that include blinking speed. I think just
Yeah.
like a New York City cop, and just like, all right, motherfucker, I need to see if you're grabbing the curry bowl, whatever the
Everything
fuck.
that goes in your
Yeah,
mouth.
yes,
Yeah.
and just be like, all right, how quick? I think someone will pick up with that in 5 years. We'll look back and like blinking speed glasses. I'll be like, no, go on, go
This
put the
this
weight
is
tree
this
more
is
over.
Wild.
it sounds so silly, man, but this is actually what occurs, right? So this is and they've checked all this to answer the other way. And going back to the nutrient density conversation, right? If I'm seeing in their tracking, they're eating a lot of things like a lot of pumpkin, a lot of potatoes. It's simply just changing those grain types, changing those starch carb sources to more densely packed food. Because a lot of the times, I love when I speak to a mother, for example, I'll say, oh, your son needs to gain weight. Oh, he eats so much. He eats like a horse. Well, what's a horse? Is it the 55-year-old female's version of a horse, or is it, the 37-year-old, 140 kilos guy's version of a horse? Because I'll tell you right now, he's not eating like a horse. So those things need to be established as well. What's the perception of intake versus what's the actual intake? A bowl of potato, a fairly substantial bowl, is probably a third or 2/3 of the calories of the same bowl of rice. So those things have to be established as well.
Yeah. I love the message that you're bringing across right now, because it's the body just responds to input.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So whatever the input is, the body's going to respond appropriately. It's not what we perceive that the input might be, or how we perceive that we're making changes to our day-to-day routine. It's what are you actually doing, and that's going to affect the results or the adaptation that you elicit.
Yeah, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is this understanding, and I'm sure you two know this, but the understanding that exercise somehow contributes to our weight management. It does, by all means, but it's not the great be-all and end-all of the results, right? Nutritional intervention is the best way to determine body composition, right? Pair that with resistance training, for example, with stimulus of anabolic response and whatnot. You're going to get a better body composition at the end. You can lose weight on Snickers bars if you need to. You look like shit, but you can still do it, right? The reality is, let's use some basic maths here and be cliche as fuck, right? 4% of your day is 1 hour. Okay, you can't determine 96% of your day with 4% of your day. That's a cliche saying, but it holds true. So it's what you do in the other 96 which determines the most usable outcome. So this is why I go back to the whole thing about parking further away from the supermarkets, loading the plates for your clients, moving more, jumping on a bike if you need to, whatever the case may be. Maximize your output inside and outside the gym, and that'll give you the biggest output. To go back on what you just said, Jiunta, it's the input versus output. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds so basic, thermodynamic rules, but it's the way of the world. We just need to be more conscious about what the inputs versus outputs are.
Yeah. Have you ever seen that there tends to be any sort of difference depending on hormone profile with people? Like people with actual hormone. I know, we're on the same wavelength right now. But people like, say hypothyroidism or things like that. What kind of changes can you see from person to person based off of things like that?
Yeah, so things like probably the more common ones that I see a lot more of things like polycystic ovary syndrome. So PCOS, as it's commonly called. So PCOS, people just have a lower RMR. They just do. So they're lower resting metabolic rate. And they're going back to the whole equation thing. It's hard to determine what that's going to be. And that's why the equation is one thing, but you need to test the waters with the individual. So that's probably the biggest thing you'll see more commonly. And whether or not it's just the diagnosis principles are getting better or whatever the case may be, or they're expanding the criteria to have polycystic, but it's definitely becoming more prominent, especially in females because of a history of disordered eating and things like that, which is becoming so common within the fitness realm as well. So that can cause, if you are diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome, that can actually cause a lower level of RMR.
Now, with PCOS being the more common or the most common hormonal imbalance that could lead to some sort of, and again, not necessarily a disruption of energy in, energy out. It's just a misunderstanding of actually how much energy out we have versus how much energy in we need. Because I think, it does always come down to caloric surplus, caloric deficit, but it's understanding the energy expenditure part. Now, PCOS, most common, but how often are people self-diagnosing with like some sort of hormonal issue that's undiagnosed? That's actually like, actually we're gonna check your bloods. You're just a lazy piece of shit.
12 out of 10 times. No, too much, man. Too much is the short answer. The amount of people who have a hormonal profile. I love to think, it's your hormones. There's 52 of them. Which fucking one are you talking about? Like, there's like, drives me wild, man. Sorry, I'm going to go into a rant. I'm trying not to.
No, go.
Yeah, that's what this is about.
I just want to put a quarter in Phil and watch him go.
When people say shit like, "Oh, my hormones are unbalanced," what the fuck are you talking about? Like, yeah, you may have an issue with, and if we're talking about females specifically, it could be an issue with menstrual cycle, for example. So you have you have oligomenoreic, you have anovulary, which means they don't ovulate. You have a whole bunch of sort of subsets within the actual menstrual cycle themselves, and there could be some disruption there. But if you clean the baseline of your diet up, the chances of that returning over a due course period of time is pretty fucking high. So, to say that somebody has a hormone concern, if we say in the menstrual cycle conversation, right, eumenorrhea, meaning typical menstrual cycle, ranges between 21 days and 35 days. So if you're one of the poor girls who gets the menstrual cycle for 21 days, you are still classified as eumenorrheic. If you're a person who gets it every 35 days, you're still classified as eumenorrheic. There's, finding a female who's 28 days on the money is like hen's teeth. It's not very common at all in the slightest. But if you went to a certain, let's say naturopath, right? And they tell you, oh, no, you got 22 days. It's like, oh, no, your hormones are out. No, they're fucking not. They're normal. They're just falling within a wider range of scope. So shut the fuck up and move on with your life, because there's bigger fish to fry, right? Turn the big rocks over first. And a lot of the stuff that we combat and we compete against is going to come up naturally. Like a lot of these, a really easy example of that is things like natural quote unquote test boosters. They don't necessarily affect our testosterone. What they do is actually help, they're adaptogens that actually help to reduce our perceived stress level, and everything else just lifts alongside it, right? So things like, ashwagandha and whatnot are beneficial, but they're going to help everything else raise as well. They're not going to affect our direct test level. So with that sort of stuff, going back to the hormones, if you have poor energy intake, if you overtrain, if you don't have adequate recovery, if you're sleep sheltered, if you're not getting enough N3 sleep, all of these things are occurring. If we get those things sorted first, a lot of the hormonal imbalances that you're claiming or you're being told you have will just naturally correct themselves.
How much do you think the broadening of the ranges of some of these, what were very tightly constrained, accepted normal, like the 28 days, how much like deference do you give to the idea that it's exposure to plastics or environmental estrogens or all that? Like, is there been like a fundamental shift in the foundation of what we find acceptable now? And do you how much do you feel like some exposures to synthetic, whatever, whether it's plastics, whether it's estrogens, people are putting too much soy sauce on shit, like what is your take on that, like all that offshoot conversation? Because I want to start talking about like artificial sweeteners and some of these synthetic things, but how much do you think environment could be playing a role in just the overall broader accepted ranges that we see now?
Yeah, I would say moderate. I would say a moderate amount, to be honest with you. Like you've got some pretty damning evidence coming out on things like testosterone reductions and things like that. They're actually being affected. I mean, that's pretty well established now. It's probably not mainstream science, but it's definitely hitting it. But things like estrogen receptor blocking and things like from plastics and different carcinogens that exist, I think it's becoming more and more prominent. The widening of the criteria for different health concerns, it's probably more medical awareness now, to be honest with you. So things like, and I'll use saying on polycystic ovary because we've just talked about it before, polycystic ovary syndrome. You used to actually have physical cysts before they would deem it to be PCOS. There was a criteria of a number of different symptoms you have to have. You tick all the boxes, and then you could be deemed to have PCOS. Now you don't necessarily have to have the cysts themselves, at least in Australia anyway. Some of the countries may be either ahead or behind the eight ball on that one. So that's one of the bigger things. They're saying, listen, hey, there's a group of symptoms that exist, and that's why it's called a syndrome, right? There's no determinate disease present. It's just a group of symptoms that exist. Hence the reason why it's a syndrome. So I think that's becoming more prominent because of potential better understanding within the medical profession. But to go back on your question, I actually do think there's an implication when it comes to things like exposure to plastics, exposure to certain chemicals in water, and all those things. They can't be a zero status. That just can't be.
Right. Well, so, sorry, but one thing that you mentioned before was the word stress, right, and how that affects hormone profile and testosterone and things like that. But in terms of kind of nutrition and physiological context, what is stress to the body in terms of how we process food, how we adapt to exercise, how we perceive our work situation?
Yeah, so stress is a huge player. So a good example is acute stress. We all know enough now to know that acute stress is beneficial, chronic stress is detrimental, right? From a hunger sort of position, or from an appetite position, I should say, probably more to do with than just hunger. Acute stress will actually generally, this is where the mistake goes, it inhibits hunger. So obviously stress is a reactionary cause. It's saying, hey, listen, there could be a saber-toothed tiger about to come around that corner and chase you down the park. So you need to prepare for that. So basically what happens is your body sort of sends blood away from the digestive system and out to the peripheries. And that's going to allow you to have a higher response from that potential saber-toothed tiger or whatever danger. Your body can react to stress, whether it be emotional stress, physical stress, mental stress, it doesn't matter. It reacts the same way. So having that understanding and applying that and applying implications to calm the stress down is really important. But then we extend on to, if that extends past a certain point, it becomes chronic stress. Now, with chronic stress, we have impaired glucose metabolism. So we actually have a blunting of insulin. We actually have an increased ghrelin response because once again, your body is preparing for a potential danger to be present soon. So it actually increases our hunger, and generally we increase our ghrelin, which is the key regulator. It's what's called orexigenic hormone. So it actually stimulates hunger. That's going to actually go to the brain, actually blunt certain mechanisms of the brain in order to prevent any leptin response or leptin release from the fat stores. That's going to then create a higher drive for palatable foods. So palatable foods being eating salt, sugar, fat, and acid. They're the four palatabilities, right? So that's going to create a higher demand and a higher desire for those high, generally higher caloric intake foods. And it's going to help create an ease of overconsumption, I suppose the first thing is.
Now, you mentioned palatability, and I kind of wanted to touch on this a little bit. The role that artificial sweeteners have, I feel like, of all debates that have been going on for so long and are so lopsided that I'm confused. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still grabbing a Diet Coke. Like if I'm just doing it because like I get confused just watching the reels. If I'm being 100% honest, I have seen reels and I'm like, I don't know what to think. Because again, like there is purposeful gerrymandering of a point in order to be like, this is me being right in this case in 60 seconds. I was like, yeah, there's probably a lot more context to it. Like, do artificial sweeteners spike insulin?
No.
If there's no sugar, okay. This is really so.
That was easy.
What I guess,
Debunked.
okay. What is your general tone on artificial sweeteners? Is there a difference between sorbitol or ascorbate potassium or stevia? Like what's the go with artificial sweeteners?
So basically, they're used as a sweetening agent. As a short answer, I mean, and there is a difference. I mean, there's a difference in one. They're not. Some people like to think that they're non-caloric. In actual fact, they actually have a calorie count to it. It's just whether or not we have the enzyme within our digestive system to actually break them down or not. So the example would be like mannitol, for example, is one of the key ones. Mannitol is one of the FODMAPs, so it's actually part of the polyol group, which could cause gastric discomfort for a lot of people. So it classifies as a non-digestible. So in high doses, you can create irritability in those with sensitive guts, which can create gastric discomfort, which then creates things like the runs, or in other people, it create constipation. It generally creates pooling in the gut as well. But from a health perspective, unless you're just doing copious amounts, there's no negative effects within the general consumption window. I mean, I like to reference aspartame because it's probably the most demonized version, because it's the one that got the bad rap a few years ago, where in actual fact, saccharin is probably the worst one for you. But aspartame is the one that got the demonized a few years back, because I think Pepsi Light or Diet Pepsi or whatever it was using it for a bit. But you need to consume like 90 cans a day for like 10 years for it to actually do anything negative to your gut. So it's an absurd amount of intake. I mean, no one's doing that. And you couldn't even do that if you tried to do that. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I had a client who was doing sort of 10 to 15 cans a day, and even that, he was getting the shits from that. Yeah, it was a lot. So that's probably where the biggest concern is going to be. You're going to find some sort of gastric discomfort before you find any sort of systemic discomfort.
Do you have any general advice on reading labels? Like things, obviously, like, hopefully people are at the point, although I've had clients like didn't even know they had nutrition facts on food. Like, oh, look at this whole novel on the back here with this little square with all these numbers. But it's like, what are some general rules when we look at to advise people or have people advise their clients, like on just reading labels, obviously calories and all that, but into the ingredients, things we like, if we see this, try and find a better substitute, look for maybe this, that, and the other. What advice do you have for those people who might be newer to this?
Yeah, the biggest one is probably understanding that dose makes the poison. So seeing letters and numbers, are mainly numbers these days, on labels does not necessarily mean that's a good or bad thing. So the example would be the sweeteners. A lot of the sweeteners, for example, colorants, all are no longer listed individually. They're listed as a sequence of numbers. If you watch Instagram and you see the demonization of some of these numbers and letters and words, understanding that dose makes the poison, just because it was in a rat poison at some absurd amount doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad for you. You need to understand that what's applicable to a rat with no citric acid cycle is not necessarily applicable to a human in the same way. So understanding that, but also the biggest thing is going to be learn the application of not just the carbohydrates, but also things like the fiber concentration of foods. How can it affect the situation you're in? Going back to something I said to you last time I was on, situation appropriate versus situation inappropriate. How is said food going to affect your exact position for that time being? Is it going to create a negative response or a positive response by how much fat is in the product, how much fibers in the product versus how much carbohydrates in the product? Understanding those implications is going to be the big thing. Also, the other one is with the ingredient list, it's sequence-based, right? So the majority of what's in the product is going to be first and then subsequently down the line. That's another thing that's probably not misunderstood as well. People will see the thing that's 15th out of 16th and they go, oh my God, that's toxic. Well, firstly, what's toxic? Secondly, how much is it? And thirdly, if it's a proprietary blend, it means dick all anyway, because you don't know how much is in there, right? So that's another consideration as well. And also just food quality too. Peanuts are not a suitable form of protein. So you're finding a product that's got peanuts plus, and then seeing it's got a high protein content does not necessarily mean it's equal to a whey protein or a piece of chicken or a piece of steak.
Are there any hard stops? Like, are there any nutritional where like there's still a practice? What comes to mind is like high fructose corn syrup. I didn't know anything about it, but it was on CNN. And I was like, if it's made its way to like Wolf Blitzer's desk, it's probably not great. So I think that's kind of been done away with. I'm sure there's still products that you could find it, but is high fructose corn syrup something that's still around? And are there equivalent public enemy number ones when it comes to ingredient lists that are still out there that you're like, nah, look, probably juice not worth the squeeze?
Do you know what? If I said to you sucrose is a disaccharide, do you guys know what's in it?
Blah 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 blah. Wah, wah. It could have been Japanese.
So sucrose is table sugar, right? It's commonly called table sugar. In most sort of westernized countries, it's made. Sorry, in the southern hemisphere, it's made from sugar cane. In the northern hemisphere, it's made from sugar beet. It's 50% sucrose, 50% fructose, 50% glucose. Okay, they're the two monosaccharides that make up the disaccharide, meaning two, obviously. High fructose corn syrup is, depending on which country of origin it comes from, you get what's called high yield fructose or low yield fructose. High yield fructose is 55% fructose and 45% glucose, and the low yield fructose is 50-50, the exact same as sucrose. Okay, so understanding that stuff makes a huge difference. So if you have a person, for example, who is demonizing high fructose corn syrup, firstly, explain that to them. How is 5% extra fructose versus glucose going to create a negative effect? The demonization of fructose as a whole is probably wildly misunderstood. And because the reason why, and this is going to sound I'm going to get too technical, apologies ahead of time. Fructose doesn't have a negative feedback loop to the PFK system. So PFK exists about halfway through glycolysis. So it stands for phosphofructokinase, and it has a negative feedback loop where it actually turns glycolysis off by the way of glucose metabolism, right? But fructose doesn't have that off switch. So it actually continues to go through because it enters further down glycolysis, not through the hexokinase process, which is where glucose enters the top of the glycolytic system, right? So with that in mind, it continued to go down, and that creates a potential for a higher formation of triglycerides to form over that of glucose because there's no negative feedback loop to stop it, to turn it off. Now, we're talking about 5% extra. It's sweet fuck all. It's not going to affect you unless you're just sitting there with Skittles and just powering it down your throat all day.
So how much of that is dependent on like the glycemic index of whatever you're eating?
Glycemic index is a hard one because glycemic index is determined by a product that you've consumed after an 8-hour fast in isolation. Now, Junta, when was the last time you had a bowl of rice with no sauce, no nothing, just a bowl of rice by itself, first thing in the morning as your breakfast?
Yeah, probably never.
Probably never, right? Because you're not from China.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where that must be considered. That's glycemic index, right? As soon as you have your rice with chicken, your rice with potato, your rice with anything, it's going to change the glycemic index of the independent food. So we have to look at glycemic load. Okay, that's the best way to do it, right? But with glycemic load and fructose doesn't stimulate insulin. Therefore, you're not going to have a high glycemic load from it.
So it doesn't matter.
It matters, but just don't put your hat on it. That's all.
Is it kind of just like an interference effect, like what we would refer to in weight training? Is like the introduction of all of these things in a real world application start to change the way we view how they work on the body?
We tend to over isolate in nutrition. We tend to sort of go, oh, well, this means this. And the example would be high fructose corn syrup, right? Oh, fructose is bad for us. But how much fructose are you actually getting in your body every day? And what and let's use fruit, because obviously fructose is known as the fruit sugar, right? If you're taking in a spoonful or a cupful of fructose, yeah, there's probably going to be some detriment to that over a given amount of time. But even in the addition of fruit, where it's naturally occurring, there's also glucose, there's also fiber, there's also different vitamins which will either encourage or inhibit the process and the passage of that particular sugar through the membrane of the gut. So, the example would be sodium concentration, right? So we know that glucose is sodium dependent. It uses what's called SLGT1, or sodium like glucose transporter 1, whereas fructose only uses GLUT5. So that's the amount of things like sodium in a certain food is going to encourage or discourage the amount of transport of the sugar that's going to pass through the membrane wall. So understanding that things don't work in isolation is one of the biggest things you can sort of do to tick the box and go, listen, this is not how it works in the body versus what it does on paper.
Right. Now, switching gears, because I just want to hit off all the popular things, so I know who to unfollow with all these nutrition reels that I watch. What's the fucking go with people eating like brains and shit? Have you seen this new guy who's like trying to out Liver King? It's like first off, more trend. But secondly, brain liver meat guy.
There's a brain guy.
Get the fuck out. There is not a brain guy.
Shut the fuck. You haven't seen this?
No, I haven't seen this. Dude, I only found Liver King like 2 months ago, by the way.
Man, I want to live in your life. I'm unfortunately inundated with the stupidest corners of the internet. Yeah, so I think to a certain degree we can all we can agree that cooking food might take some of the nutrient content out of it, right? We talked about spinach, like, just keep it all in the pan and then just drink the water as a part of the stuff that you cook, and it'll all literally come out of the wash. But like raw food people that are like popping off and just eating like raw ground beef or like raw brain or raw liver or whatever the hell.
Like, what's my thoughts on it?
Well, yeah, I'm just putting quarters in the film machine, and I'm just letting it go.
Which one's going to piss him off the most?
I enjoy beef tartare with the best of us, right? On occasion, ceviche, all of that stuff, right? But if you don't understand that the foundations of fire were what helped us come down from the fucking trees, you're a moron. I mean, that's what helped us evolve. The digestion of things like omega-3 fatty acids for brain development, the things like higher protein absorption via the way of denaturing, via the way of cooking. That's what helped us come down from the trees. What the fuck are you eating it raw for? What an idiot. Not to mention testicles. Even from a pleasantry point of view, who the fuck wants to eat that? Even if it's 2% better, cook the damn thing, you moron. That's not a clever thing to do. Sorry.
Well, there goes my testicle question.
It just like, and by the way, like bull's testicles in Australia are called prairie oysters, right? That's what, and it's quite commonly consumed in the Western areas. Things like Stockman and stuff like that. When you literally did eat nose to tail, and things like liver is incredibly high in minerals. I'm not discounting that, but cook it. cook it for the bioavailability of the proteins, for the breakdown of the fatty acids, all of these things that exist. Cooking has a benefit to the food. And yes, there's an argument, and I'll lean away from meat-based products and go into, say, vegetable-based products. And people will say things like, oh, well, doesn't cooking damage the vitamins and minerals which exist in the vegetables? Yeah, it does, but it also makes other things more absorbable. So it's sort of a win-loss situation, right? In some plants, it'll make certain micronutrients less absorbable, but it'll make others more absorbable. But then in the next plant, it'll make the ones that were broken down earlier, make them, vice versa and so forth. So vitamin C is probably the best example of that. Vitamin C is damaged in heat. So you mentioned spinach before. The spinach, which you want to get the vitamin C out of, is typically going to be best consumed raw. But there are other minerals like iron and whatnot, which are better absorbed when they're cooked.
Right. So as long as you're not pan frying your oranges, cook your fucking spinach, and then just eat your orange like a normal person, and it'll all sort itself out. So
that's actually a really good example, right? So one of the things that one of the things you see a lot in the athletic populations is either iron deficiency, iron insufficiency, or borderline iron adequacy. So and one of the biggest misunderstandings is because animal sources have what's called heme iron, which has a much higher absorbability, up to about 24% absorption rate in heme iron, whereas the absorption of non-heme iron, which exists in plants, is only about 7%. People tend to think the majority of our iron comes from animal sources. In actual fact, it comes from non-animal sources, from plant sources, just because of the sheer amount we generally eat across a given time period. So just pure volume dictates where it comes from. So if a person comes to me and says, hey, I'm borderline iron deficient or borderline iron insufficient, what I do is get them to do fruit salads. So the example would be a citrus with a kale, or a citrus with a spinach-based salad with some nuts, for example, with their chicken or with their fish. They're going to get some iron out of the meat source, going to get some iron out of the spinach and whatnot, and then the vitamin C will encourage the uptake of both the heme and non-heme iron. So finding visually palatable, and I use that term specifically because we eat with our eyes first, as my dad used to tell me when I was a kid, we eat with our eyes first. Finding visually palatable foods is the best way to move those people forward.
Magnesium.
Yeah.
You're starting to talk about, different nutrients, but magnesium is one that's pretty big and pretty, it's almost like vitamin D was a couple, years ago. Everyone's saying take magnesium. Why?
Because it does so many things in the body. It does about 350 things in the body. It's so prominently regarded. It has implications with things like immune system, with digestion, with energy production, with sleep regulation. It looks after our bone mineral density to a certain point, as well as a secondary carrier. So all of these things can all be linked back to magnesium, but magnesium's not magnesium in a sense of supplementation. So if you're going to use it by the way of supplementation, you need to be aware that the chelate binding, so the chelate being the amino acid it's bound to, will determine the function that the magnesium plays within the body. So the one that everyone's talking about now, because Andrew Huberman's obviously become quite prominent, is magnesium threonate. So it's magnesium bound to threonine, and that's actually a laboratory blend. It's not a naturally occurring magnesium. Whereas magnesium citrate, for example, is magnesium bound to citrate, phosphate, so on and so forth down the line. So you're generally going to find, if you're using it for things like cognitive assertion or things like sleep function, magnesium threonate or magnesium glycinate or biglycinate, meaning two glycines, are going to have the best effect because the particles are small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, whereas things like citrate are too large and they won't. So having those understandings about how you're actually using it. So magnesium orotate, for example, is really good for the muscles. Magnesium glycinate is actually very good for the muscles too. Magnesium citrate, if you take it in very large doses, will actually act as a laxative. So you need to be careful of that. But Shallow, you nod your head. You obviously.
Well, that was what was the thing about dosages and poisons earlier?
Dose makes the poison. Yeah.
Dose makes the poison. Well, any powerlifter out there who's gone the old mag citrate route, it's like, yeah, we know that dose makes the poison, and the poison is lethal.
It comes back to but also with magnesium as well, it comes back to the chelate chosen will be determined by how much you physically want to take. So I'll use magnesium glycinate as an example, right? It's like 20%. So if you take in, 200 milligrams of magnesium glycinate, you're only getting 20 milligrams of magnesium. So it's only 1 in 10. So it's quite low. So citrate has a much higher magnetic yield, magnesium-based magnetic yield. It's not Magneto, not X-Men, but magnesium-based yield. So with that in mind, that might be a better option because you don't quite need as much of it. But the conversation around like magnesium citrate as a laxative come from a product back in the 80s called milk of magnesia, which they used to, it was really, really high yield, and they used to make babies just shit themselves and they're clogged up. So that's where it comes from. If you just don't take that much, you'll be okay.
Now, Jay, you've touched on an interesting point about like magnesium is today where vitamin D was a few years ago, right? And we have like these waves and trends of just like hyper focusing, Phil, kind of like you said, on one specific aspect without sort of seeing the broader, maybe the tensegrity model that is nutrition. Do you have any predictions on where you see trends in the industry going? Like, I made a prediction that people were going to start running backwards like 2 years ago on a podcast. And then ever since buddy Ben Patrick was on Rogan and people started doing reverse sled pulls, people have actually started running backwards. And everyone's like, oh my God, you called it. I want the hot take. Where are the trends in nutrition moving towards into the future?
Geez, that's a hard question, to be honest, because there's so many little pockets of nutrition, as I'm sure you guys are aware. With nutrition, I think probably where we're going to go across now is we're going to move into minerals that have no nutritional RDI attached to them. So an example would be things like boron. So boron has no, yeah, exactly right. It has no nutritional RDI, so no recommended daily intake. But there's some super light evidence that suggests that it has a positive effect on testosterone levels. So and that's just one example, but we'll start to see a lot of things outside of the 40 odd micronutrients which are nominated that will be recommended just for absurd reasons, and still people will start taking like just super physiological levels of them for no reason at all. So that's where unfortunately nutrition is going, where we've created almost like a full circle where there's like supplements, cell tech days, supplements were king back in the day. Then we've moved away from supplements. Now because everyone's so health focused, quote unquote, we're all going to go back into the health regime, into the supplements, but with a health perspective. But there'll be supplements that you don't know what the fuck you're looking at. You don't know what any of those words mean or where they come from.
Well, do you know what it is? It's the kids that took cell mass when they were 16 are now like, ugh, what's this selenium stuff? All right, yeah, CoQ10, I'm going to take that. And they take it like they took their stuff because it's the same market if you just follow it, because it's us. Yeah. I remember, dude, does anyone remember a pre-workout called Nano Vapor? Does anyone remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that pre-workout.
Remember the disclaimer on the, do you remember, Jay?
No.
Oh, I think it was actually a Cell Tech product.
It was a Cell Tech product. Muscle Tech, yeah.
A Muscle Tech product. And there was a disclaimer on the logo. And it's like, God, this is great marketing because it worked for me. It was like something to the effect of don't leave the can open for more than like 30 seconds when you were taking the scoop out. And I was like, this is great. If there's any wonder or not whether or not I was going to take drugs, it was how I reacted to that. I was like, this can't be exposed to open air. Outside the open air that's already in the container for 30 seconds, you fucking moron. So I would literally just sit there and be like, I'd have a friend ready and be like, hey, you got the glass with the water? Yeah, okay. And we would like, me and my buddy Jake, I would open it quickly, scoop, and I would put it back in. I'm like, do you think it was too long? He's like, I don't know. We should probably drink it now. I'm like, okay. And now it's like, yeah, I feel as if it's the same generation that got taken in under the sports supplement route as kids is now kind of just being taken in by this periodic table throwing of dartboards. Like boron, what is it, like the fifth element or something like that? What's going to be next?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to know, did you have a backing track when you did that? Like with like Mission Impossible style, crack the lid and get.
Oh yeah. Oh, just like a theme song. Yeah. It was that Pink Panther theme song.
Yeah.
That's what it was. Yeah.
I'll give you a really good example, right? So recently I saw. So you mentioned selenium. That's a really good example, right? To get enough selenium for the day, you can do it in one go with one Brazil nut, singular. That's how much selenium you need in a given day. But I've literally seen a post on social media of it. It was a photo of a Brazil nut and a chick put it up, and she said, "Get my daily selenium." What the fuck? What an idiot! Like, why does that need to be said? Just eat your Brazil nut and move on with your day. Like, you can get your selenium in bits and pieces from the rest of your food, or you can eat one Brazil nut. Why is that a notable part of your day?
But you know what? I blame the Brazil nut manufacturers for not doubling down on this. Because what if they just change the name to selenium tablets?
Yeah.
Like, I think maybe in a trend in industry where it's like, hey, transparency is a really big part of all big industries, right? Like, everyone, like, what are you doing with my data? Apple's like, we're not doing anything with your data. Google's like, well, we are. And it could be the same thing with food. It's just like, rather than having these clever terms, just being like, this is selenium 1.0, vitamin E 0.3, and then it's like we just taxonomize food purely based off of its content rather than like, oh, it's Brazil. Like, I've always wanted to go there. Brazil they seem so friendly. I met a Brazilian once, and then someone eats a Brazil nut and then goes and takes a multivitamin like an asshole.
Yeah. So I think yeah, that yeah, I agree. That's probably where I think it's going. Is those the non-specific nutrients which don't matter in the scheme of things. Or you got to remember is one thing was explained to me once, and I thought this was a really good take on it. Right. This is one of the reasons why supplements in the multivitamin world should be taken with as a secondary conversation versus fruit versus the inclusion of whole food fruits, because there are things we don't quite understand about the food yet. So there are things like bioflavonoids and stuff like that which exist within the different specified bits of fruit, which are attached to vitamin C and attached to the different minerals we have, that we don't understand where the cofactors exist, where they actually help and benefit our health as an overall. So when you're taking in ascorbic acid in a synthetic version versus, say, for example, vitamin C that's attached to a pomegranate, hypothetically, there's things in that pomegranate we don't know yet. We don't know exist. So when you're taking in these weird and wonderful minerals people are thinking of from the wild, wild west, they may not have the same benefit as taking it in accumulatively over the day of the course of the food. That's where I think the issue is going to lie with moving forward.
Well, for me, like, say what you want about nano vapor, and I'll defend it to the fucking death. At least, and this is always kind of where, like, I think sports supplementation or bodybuilding, whatever, pre-workout markets are always going to win. Because if I drink enough C4 canned energy drinks, I'm like, I can't feel my face. I'm not going to be okay for a long time. Where it's like, with sort of what you're talking about, these trace mineral, heavy metal, periodic table, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, lithium, helium, beryllium, all this shit. It's like, did it work? Am I doing it? Oh, I just do this now. I just take this with breakfast, like someone I'm in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and someone just comes around with a little thing they put ketchup in at McDonald's and be like, all right, take your pills now. Like, I don't know. Like, I guess it's work. I guess we'll find out on my deathbed. It's like, oh, longevity, because that does seem to be the shift. Is nutrition around longevity. Like, nothing drives me more up the fucking wall. And I do like his podcast, but holy shit, he doesn't do it anymore. But like, when Peter Attia was on some like intermittent fasting shit, and he would like go on his Instagram, like that one dude who had to chop his arm off. Do you guys know the guy who chopped his arm off?
Yeah.
137 hours. Jay, have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Where he like gets his arm pinned in a boulder, and he's like on his video camera, he's like drinking his own piss. He's like, I'm kind of losing my mind here. Hold on, an idea. Snap. Like, carves his fucking arm off. And it's like Peter T used to go on and be like, I haven't had food in 3 days. Says my ketones are so high. It's like, dude, chop your fucking arm off. Like, what are you doing? But it's like, longevity seems to be such a zero-sum game, because like, what is it? You celebrate your 93rd birthday. I'm like, man, I'm really glad I took my NADH injections for 30 years, like a crazy but you can step outside and get hit by a fucking bus. Like, the longevity market to me is where the money in nutrition supplementation seems to be moving.
Yeah, and the problem is if you do all those things, the NMDA and all this sort of stuff, you're going to end up with about 127 days extra. That's pretty much what you're going to get. Like it's not going to be a lot if it is anything at all in the slightest. But a lot of the intermittent fasting drives me fucking wild. A lot of the things where the claims are going to be linked to the overall fat loss and caloric restriction that comes from the loss in body fat. That's where the benefit's going to come from. You see things like, reduced triglycerides, reduced cholesterol levels, all of these things that come from that people will claim will happen in the presence of IF, when in actual fact, the benefits are coming from the fact that you've just lost body fat. The inflammation responses or anti-inflammation response, I should say, all of these things that occur aren't occurring because of intermittent fasting. They're occurring because of caloric restriction. You're just having to condense your caloric restriction into an 8-hour window. That's where the difference lies. So, and even talking to the demographic of this podcast, it's not beneficial for muscle mass at all in the slightest. In actual fact, you're probably going to inhibit muscle mass. Like, will it be adequate? Yeah, probably. But no one's listening to this podcast going, "Geez, I want to be normal." Like, it's not how it works. The three of us are striving to be stronger, bigger, better, faster, as the documentary suggested, and all of these things that tend to sort of push people towards these sorts of podcasts and these sorts of interests. So with that in mind, if you're missing your protein windows, protein spiking windows, they know that for the average person, 3 feedings a day is going to be suitable, but doesn't mean it's optimal. They know that there's minimal change in dose dependency when it comes to protein after 3 feedings above 0.3 grams per kilo, I should clarify the end of that. But once again, that's not necessarily optimal. And IF inhibits that optimization of your nutritional intake if your goal is to be stronger, if your goal is to be bigger, if your goal is for hypertrophy, all of these things. So don't fucking do it if your goal is muscle mass.
One of the cited things, and it spirals into another subtopic I think would be interesting to touch on, is I know some IF, let's call them zealots, and they're like, the mental clarity, you don't understand. You can't even talk to you. I can't even see you through all of your brain fog. You are so foggy right now. I can't even see you. I'm like, I don't know. I feel pretty good. Like, and he's like, no, you don't even know how bad you feel until you get the sharpness that comes with not eating breakfast. I was like, that's a tough sell, man. But like the cognitive side of nutritional interventions and nutritional supplementation interventions is as hot right now as, the magnesium or the vitamin D was. What's the finger on the pulse of the current status of like cognition as a desired outcome of dietary and supplementation intervention?
Modafinil. No.
Straight dope. Yeah, let's just get that Adderall and spin.
No, probably a big one for me is probably alpha GPC is probably where I sort of tend to lean towards. It just makes you feel clear. For nutritional intervention, look, they have a point, to be honest. There is quite an anecdotal reporting of mental clarity in periods of fasting, and that is true. That does actually occur, and that's just because of the way the brain works when it comes to periods of absence of appetite absence. So when you actually have periods of lower levels of glucose, your body will start to upregulate ketones. You don't need to be, fasted for 3 fucking days to be in to get ketones. Ketosis is a different state, right? But ketones start to release after about 8 to 16 hours, depending on the individual nuance of the person. So you can start to get a little bit of a neuro benefit from that after a window of time. And in considering skipping breakfast means if you just fasted from the night before, you most likely have got that 8 to 10 to 12 hours happening. So you're going to get that neurocognitive benefit from that. But it's short-lived, right? It's short-lived because the moment you put glucose in, you're going to change things. The moment you have a coffee, you're going to change things. All of these things start to benefit. But a lot of these people who do say stuff like that, they'll have a coffee, a big fuck off quad shot coffee in the morning. Now, if you've got nothing in your gut to inhibit that caffeine uptake, that caffeine regulation, you're probably going to get a bigger hit from the coffee than you would if you had a whole bunch of breakfast in your gut as well. So there's all of these contributing factors that occur through as well. But when it comes to supplements, to be honest with you, man, alpha GPC and then long-term creatine usage is probably the two that I'd probably suggest.
Yeah, it's always posed to me by people who are always kind of retarded anyways. It's like, oh man, I feel so clear. It's like, yeah, but you're fanning a really low flame. Like you're not that smart. So this is kind of what like most people feel like all the time. You're just maybe normal now.
Yeah. But it's funny because that saying you said before about, you don't know what what people feel is common, not necessarily normal. I use that all the time as well, but not a link to fasting, that's for sure.
Now, from a performance standpoint, the introduction of some of these more cognitively driven, as far as outcomes are concerned, we're starting to see these sort of seep in into like pre-workouts and things like that. And obviously, to more crazy degrees, you start to see like you talked about modafinil just in passing, or Adderall. You're starting to see cognition be a big part of sports performance supplementation. Do we see that trend continuing? Is alpha GPC kind of like the creatine of cognition? Well, not that creatine is just solely in the realm of like hypertrophy or strength or whatever, an ergogenic aid, if you will. Do you see there being a greater push of cognitive supplementation being put into the sports performance world, or is alpha GPC kind of like, yeah, that's really all you need?
Oh, there's a whole host, man, to be honest. I think personally they'll come down pretty hard soon on that sort of stuff. I think there's going to be a push where they're going to bring down the hammer with USADA or OSADA, whichever country of origin you want to talk about, because there's a whole bunch of things within the wider regulations which they can't test for. They just hope and pray that you don't take it, is a short answer. So with that in mind, I think there's going to be a come down on tested sports. Even, for example, caffeine usage. There are some sports that don't allow caffeine usage of day of play. So yeah, they do exist, man, or they have limitations, for example, right? Not that there's a way to test that, but they do have like this honesty system where you hope you don't take X amount over a given time period. So I think alpha GPC is probably one of the ones that will stick. The problem with cognitive supplementations in the sporting and performance world is the purity of the supplement, in the sense that very, very few products are going, or brands, I should say, are going to test their products through Huster or Informed Sport or Informed Choice, whichever. There's 20 different versions of it now who do sort of third-party testing on supplements. They're not going to waste their money doing that with neurocognition-based supplements. It's just not going to happen. It's too expensive.
Everyone just laces their alpha GPC with cocaine.
Yeah.
that's the sporting event I want to show up to. Like, man, Highlight is so much fun. Everyone just blasted out of their lives.
Fucking highlight. But no, it's look, going back to your original question, the short answer is I would stick to things like alpha GPC, creatine, common creatine usage to make sure you do your daily 5 grams per day, and then, of course, caffeine intervention during the period of exertion. That's probably literally it. I know there's others as well, but the jury's still well and truly out.
Lion's mane is a big one too. The mushrooms.
That was actually one of the ones I was thinking of as well. Lion's mane has got some really cool evidence coming out on it, but you do need quite a lot of it. You do need quite and more than a cup of tea of it. Like, you can't just make your lion's mane cup of tea and go for gold, right? It has to be, the dosage has to be. Actually, to be honest, man, Dr. Dwayne's probably the best person to ask about lion's mane more than me. But in saying that, though, I do know the dosage is quite high for lion's mane.
If I can't hear colors, I'm not eating the mushrooms. That's like kind of my rule. That's kind of, everyone's like, oh, it's got like reishi in it. And I was like, it tastes terrible. The people are trying to convince me that this tastes like coffee. It's like, it's not coffee, because coffee is a thing that's coffee. And mushrooms are things that are mushrooms. I don't put coffee on my pizza. I don't put mushrooms in my thing. And I'll, sit back with Grateful Dead album and I'll eat some mushrooms and I'll hear colors and all that.
Sorry, Jordan. Just because there's when you go down performance, and this is probably more of a tangent than anything, but it'll make sense in the end. When you go down performance, when you go to performance supplementation, performance nutrition, you have to, once again, isolation has to be excluded, right? Everything's in unison. So let's talk about, staying on the lion's mane conversation. Let's talk about things like cordyceps, right? So cordyceps increases oxygen carry through the bloodstream, but is that beneficial now? Or is that beneficial over a tolerance period where you build it up? Is things that's going to benefit the sleep night before, or the sleep in a sequence of nights before? Is that going to benefit your performance? So when we talk about performance-based supplementation, is what's the bigger picture and what's going to benefit the, shit flows downhill, so to speak, right? So can we start things upstream and allow the benefit to present at the end of the stream? That may be how a better conversation when we're talking about the 1 or 2% that benefits from a supplement or from a chosen nutritional intervention is in general may not present right now. It may present down the future.
I remember I did a climb in the Sierras. That was like, 13,000 feet. And I like semi-prepared for it enough that I didn't die. But then I was with a few guys who were doing it, and they had like beet chips or beet whatever, and they're like,
Beet
oh,
chips,
beets
yeah.
are good.
Yeah.
Beets are good for like oxygen or whatever. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, dude, I'm just hungry, and I've been walking uphill for 16 hours. But at the end of it, I was like, I'm certain those did absolutely nothing for me. Because then I got out at the bottom of the hill and I took a piss, and it was like completely red. I'm like, great, my kidneys are shutting down.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that it was the beets. And I was like, oh, yeah, probably not the best go. Now,
I've had a few scary beta vulgaris instances where I've thought I had colon cancer suddenly in the morning. But yeah, it's I should say beta vulgaris is the principal name of beet, by the way. That's the reason. So it creates nitric oxide response in the blood.
So you just like had a nice, maybe there was some walnuts in the salad too, maybe some like cranberries, and then you wake up the next day and like, oh God, I'm dead.
Yeah. Oh shit. Stage 4. No. Yeah. Those things. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, just on the other end of like our cocaine talk, sleep. Just to kind of bring this whole thing, because we talked about intermittent fasting, which is like, hey, don't eat in the morning, but you should probably eat in the morning. And then we're like, hey, all right, pre-workout performance stuff. All right, here's maybe what works and what doesn't, and all this, and like, all right, yeah, cognition, and now our day is coming to a close. The big one for me, honestly, is drugs and alcohol. That's the gripe that I have with sleep, because I'm not a big marijuana guy.
Yeah.
I did a weed once, and I was like, I'm so uncomfortable. Like edibles, I was just I got a little footrest over there, and that was me. I was just there, and I went to bed just like, oh, no one will ask me questions if I'm in bed, so I just like ran upstairs and went to bed. But it's like, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the stuff that's overhyped, overmarketed? What works for most people most of the time? Where do we see the trends going?
Yeah, cool. So sleep, I think one of the biggest, the low-hanging fruit of sleep is understanding it. The first word to start with, right? Understanding that sleep. I love the conversation. People say to me, "Oh, let's use REM sleep for example. REM sleep's the deepest form of sleep." No, it's not. REM sleep's actually the second lightest form of sleep. The sleep cycles are circular, not linear. So they go N1, N2, N3 REM. Okay, so that's they work in a cycle. So REM sleep, your heart rate, your blood pressure is almost at waking status. So understanding where the sleep cycle lies and where the most recoverable sleep is coming from is happening in the first half of the night, whereas most of your REM sleep happens in the latter half of the night. And that's because the body's restoration is the principal primary outcome of the sleep function, right? So understanding that sort of stuff, understanding that quality of sleep, the effects of sleep. So the things that affect sleep. So things like alcohol you mentioned, for example, that's going to affect duration of sleep. It's going to affect SOL, which is sleep onset latency. It's going to affect your ability to go into N3 sleep, we're commonly called deep sleep or slow wave sleep. Those things are actually going to play a massive factor. Nutritional intervention as well is going to be a big factor. So for example, if you have a high fat diet, it generally affects SOL, so it affects the ability of time you need to get to sleep. Higher carbohydrates closer to bedtime tend to actually benefit sleep because they shuttle leucine away from the brain, which is taking the place of tryptophan to create serotonin in the blood-brain barrier passage. So all of those things as well. But some of the basic behaviors is things like reading before bed, consistency in bedtime, minimizing screens. I'm sure you guys are all aware of that sort of stuff. Even things like blue blocker glasses. I'm not a big gadgets guy, but there's some evidence to suggest that blue blocker glasses can increase melatonin production by 58% for those people who actually do have a late sort of habit of being in front of screens. That's quite a pronounced amount, if anything, And then also, personally, the trick I use actually is auditory stimulation. So I actually listen to sounds when I sleep, and it's not whale songs and shit like that. I listen to American sitcoms. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I have a really overactive brain. So when I have sound on, my brain goes into like fucking taxes and all sort of shit, right? So that's what my brain goes. So I listen to like Seinfeld and I listen to How I Met Your Mother and all of these comedies that I know them so well, I can picture the episode and it puts me in a dream state and I drop off. Whereas I tried to do it with Egyptian documentaries once and I just sat up and watched the whole fucking documentary because I was interested in it. So
nothing puts me to sleep like an episode of Friends. So stupid. It's like, oh, I'd rather do anything. I'd rather not be alive. It's like, I'm not going to die, but maybe I'll just go to sleep.
I can't stand that show, man. It's stupid fucking show.
I saw someone wearing 3 masks and a Friends t-shirt. I was like, man, you're never going to be my friend.
Yeah.
It's like, we have nothing in common. You and I are not the same.
Yeah. But I like to sort of, I don't know, I like to sort of point out, and this is something that a lot of my clients who listen to this show have said to me, heard me say before, right? The body has one primary, we always talk about the meaning of life. The meaning of life, forget all like you to find a partner. It's don't fucking die. That's the meaning of life, right? So we have this recovery period of time. So when I said before about sleep, the restorative sleep that happens in the largest window in the first half of the sleep. Part of it's because of the systems, part of it's because of the diurnal clock that we actually have internally. But if we have a whole bunch of brain waste and a whole bunch of physiological repair that needs to happen, the brain's going to cover that first, and then it's going to bring in the niceties at the end. You know, even things like sleep cycles, for example, we have between sort of 4 and 6 sleep cycles through the night, depending on who you are as a person. The first cycle occurs in a shorter window of time than the cycles after the fact. And that's because the brain has to rapidly accept that recovery window to be stimulated before it actually moves on to any sort of niceties around dreaming. But also from the thyroid function, so back to that diurnal circadian rhythm that we always talk about, when the thyroid kicks in at sort of like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, that's going to, in its own right, raise basal metabolic temperature. It's going to raise heart rate. Is going to raise blood pressure. So it makes more sense that our REM sleep would occur when that's happening anyway. Yeah. So understanding those functions make the biggest difference to how we actually apply our sleep. If you're a person who rushes sleep, it's really important you do get that consistency in your bedtime to really make a habit formation.
Is there data around this that you look to collect? Like how much do you, lean on fitness trackers, Oura rings, Whoop bands, apps, things like that?
I wear a Whoop band personally, but Oura rings are fine as well. But you have to be very careful with introducing these. It all depends on the person. And let's say, for example, you have a high-profile sporting athlete and their sleep is shit house. You're probably better off introducing the tracking aspect of sleep after the competition they're leaning into. As detriment as sort of like weird as that sounds, because you can actually get a paranoia around it, and they start to overthink it, and that starts to inhibit their sleep further. So introducing education prior, but actually introducing the tracking aspect after may actually be beneficial to them long term. So those things you do have to sort of be considerate of that. But as for how much do I track it, I encourage my clients to get a tracker of sorts, but I don't make it mandatory. It's more of a reference. I use both a subjective and objective metric. So subjective being, how do you rate your sleep out of 10? The other question you can really ask is the question I was asking is, what time do you go to bed? And they go, 10 o'clock. Yeah, but what time do you go to sleep? Yeah. Because people have this perception that when they go to bed and turn the light off that they're asleep. And it's like, no, dude, you haven't. You've sat around on your phone for 25 minutes or even longer in some cases, an hour or more. You know, if someone says to me, oh no, I'm great, my head's the pillow and I'm out. Okay. That's called SOL. That's sleep onset latency. That indicates if you're a person who falls asleep within 5 minutes of hitting the pillow, you generally indicate you need more sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember falling asleep. I wake up every morning. I'm like, how the fuck did I get to bed last night?
One of the things that I do, and I'm sort of similar to a point. I probably 15 minutes or so. The ideal time is between 5 and 15 minutes is where you sort of really want to sit for that SOL. But the reality is, I'm going to use a real douchebaggy term now. Biphasic sleeping is what I personally use. The fancy way of saying that is napping. Okay, I nap a lot. So I generally do these things called productivity reports to myself, because I start at sort of 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, this is a true thing. I actually do this, right? So about 4:30, 5 in the morning is when I start, because I have a few clients that are overseas in different time zones. I'll work till about midday, and then I'll self-assess. All right, am I working above or below 75% capacity? If it's below 75%, I'm better off going to lose 40 minutes and then coming back at a higher production rate, because then I can actually come back and I'll basically catch up to where the time I've lost, if that makes sense. Whereas if I'm working above that, I can continue on for the rest of the day. And that's the assessment I do on myself. And it sounds counterproductive to go for a sleep. Like I said, if your productivity is so low that if you fuck off for 45 minutes and come back, you'll actually work at a higher rate where you'll catch yourself up by the end of the day and you'll feel better for it.
I do that every 2 weeks. My body just puts me down for 16 hours. It's just like, hey, this is a horizontal surface. You stay here now until the next day. So I've fallen asleep. My right hand to God and Tess can attest to this. I have fallen asleep, so when I'm in bed, I just take my contacts out. I've fallen asleep between taking my right contact lens out and my left contact lens. So I woke up like, oh, fuck, I finally had that stroke that I've been worried about. And I can only see out of one eye. And I'm like, oh, wait, I still have my left contact lens in because I fell asleep at the time between taking out my right and my left.
So obviously sleep debt's a big factor for you, obviously. So sleep debt is obviously sleep need versus
And
sleep
student
attainment.
debt. Student debt's also a big factor, but sleep debt's also a big issue. Actually, the student debt drives the sleep debt, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
So you actually can sleep bank as well, right? So you can sleep debt. So sleep debt obviously is the loss of need versus actual attainment. Then you can actually get sleep banking. So sleep banking is deliberately sleeping over your need in order to accommodate for any future progressive debt that you may acquire. Now, this is where I think misunderstanding is. It's not one for one. So if you have a sleep debt of, let's say, for example, let's use the standardized term of 8 hours, which is a ridiculous thing to claim, but let's say 8 hours, right? You get 8 hours every single night. Then for a week, you get 7 hours. So eventually by the end of the week, you're 7 hours in sleep debt, right? The concept of you then getting that back in 2 days is ridiculous. You're not going to suddenly sleep 12 hours in 2 days, over 2 days. It's not going to happen, right? But that's not how it works. It's not one for one. Your brain actually requires less makeup time than it does lost time. It's about 2:1. So if you sleep, for example, 30 minutes extra, it'll pretty much account for approximately 60 minutes of lost time. And that's because your body actually adapts the duration in which it spends in that N3 and REM state. So it actually expands that time per cycle, per sleep cycle. So that's actually a real thing you can do. Additionally, as well, to go back on what you just said, Jordan, the reality is that consistent habitual sleep benefit is going to outweigh any sort of periodical sleep increase. So if I said to you, listen, if you lose 16 hours of your day every 2 weeks, if I applied 1 hour of each of those 16 hours to one of the previous 14 days, 1, you would get more done. 2, you'd actually feel better. And 3, your health ramifications would be much more positive.
I'd agree with you. And then my brain would still wake me up at stupid hours in the morning.
Yeah. It's one of those things that we all, and I've had many a comment from clients that I'll return a text at weird, at fuck off AM in the morning and still be okay with it. In fact, Joey comments on it all the time. Jordan always says to me, "Dude, do you ever sleep?" And I go, "Yeah, I do. I just sleep weirdly."
Yeah, Jordan and
I've
Joey. I've
never texted Shallow that you haven't responded, even if it's like 1, 3, 4, doesn't matter what time it is in the morning.
I'm here for it. It's and you know what it is? It's not by choice. It's just my brain wakes me up. But I'm afraid that there might be a trend starting of people just limiting their sleep because you
started this burn the boats theory, right?
But that has nothing to do. That just means like commit to shit. It doesn't mean like you can do it. I don't know if you know him. But I'm sure at some point you'll meet him. Lou bombs bodies. So shout out Lou if you're listening. Yeah. He's amazing because he's like anti that. He's not Lou. You're not catching. If Lou's up at 5:30 a.m., it's because he's been up because he hadn't been to sleep. You've been tired one on for the night before, and he'll wake up at 10:30 and just be like, "Yeah, burning the boats." 10:30 in the morning. And I'm like, that's what it's all about, man. So funny.
I think it's probably started a counterculture of just bring some spare wood to rebuild the boats. I mean, that's the reality of what we need to look at. Because actually, Paddy Roach said something to me a while back. Paddy Roach said to me, he used to wake up at 5 a.m. to start the day, and then he asked himself why. Like if he does 9 or 10 hours a day, but he starts at 8 a.m. instead of saying at 5 a.m., does it change anything of productivity? Not really, but he gets more sleep because part of that culture now is to get up at bullshit a.m. to start your day. You can. I've got no issue doing that. I do it myself. I'm being hypocritical saying this, right? But you have to correct your sleep patterns in order to do it. Like that's one of the prerequisites in order to be one of the 4:30 crew.
Well, it's funny because the saying, if I'm not mistaken, from the art is because it originally stemmed from the Art of War, but it's kind of like gone through iterations in history. I think it was, I could be totally fucking this up, but I'm pretty sure the saying is burn the boats, but spare the trees.
Yeah.
So it's like, don't completely fuck yourself. Like the idea is like, all right, but because you burn the trees, it's like you're not building any boats and you're going to make your time there way worse. And I think it's probably more of like you need it in the environment type thing. But I think the saying is don't completely fuck yourself. Like commit, but also, because I think in the Art of War, that's the passage, is burn the boats, but spare the trees.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't have 40 fingers, so I couldn't have tattooed that. So I'm like, all right, we'll go with this. But I'm like, guys, read the book. Don't fuck. Yeah, it's just like, don't try this at home, kids.
It's a bit like the jack of all trades comment, isn't it? You know, the jack of all trades, master of none. But then it's like being a master of one is better being a jack of all. Was it jack of all trades, master of none? But being a jack of some is better being a master of none, or something like that. The full saying is. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the essence of it.
Yeah. But no, it's just we like to sort of shorten things and take the bits we like out of it. Yeah. I've got the Invictus, the end of the Invictus poem on my back, and it's, you know, captain of my fate, master of my soul. So sort of from the Invictus poem.
Yeah. Well, you got a big enough back. You could probably get the whole thing in there if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Anything to close on? Anything in the nutritional world that you find either infuriating or you find misleading or both, or things that you wish people started paying more attention to before we wrap?
There's two things probably. The first one is get rid of full day of eating videos. No one cares. Secondly, just along with that as well.
That was so odd. Like, I was ready to go. Okay, when is he going to give me? When is it free, Mike?
Fuck your day of eating.
Yeah, I don't care. And secondly, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it doesn't apply to me. It doesn't apply to you. It doesn't apply to anyone else who's watching the video. Your calories for a reason. Your calories determined by your output, as Jiunta said before, right? So just be aware of that as well. Secondly, those people who are striving for constant progress, don't forget the process involved as well, and you can reflect on the progress in which you've made. So that's one of the biggest things. I've had a conversation quite recently about that. It's like we tend to sort of we don't recognize the progress we've made when we're looking at the process in front of us, and I think that's a big factor as well. Everyone takes a step every single day, and I can't stand. I can't stand the I'm going to have a great day mentality today. I don't like that. Break the day up. If you're having issues with maintaining a diet or sticking to a process or whatever the case may be, break the day up into small chunks. Break the day up into, I'm going to have a great breakfast. I'm going to have a great session with this client. I'm going to have a great lunch. I'm going to have a great afternoon tea. And then you can look back at the end of the day. I nailed today. I won it. I won the day. But when you wake up with the mentality, I'm going to win the day today, or I'm going to sort of have a great day today ahead of time, one spanner in the works and you throw the whole day apart. Okay. Break it up in small chunks and achieve things accordingly across the chronological order, and look back and you reflect on the whole day and you've won the day. Do that 5 days out of 7, you've won the week. 3 out of 4, you've won the week. Don't throw the baby out of the bathwater. Understand that the process ahead of you, but don't discount the progress you've made behind you.
Yeah, my mom texts me every day. Says, "Have a good day." I say, "Fuck you, mom."
Damn,
it is kind of this David Goggins, like 1% better every day, and I find there's no room for retribution.
Yeah, and that's it. Like if you have a shitty lunch, but you had a great breakfast, great morning tea, great afternoon tea, great dinner, you can account that that's still a win of the day, right?
Yeah, it's a great day for a hobbit. What the fuck did you just say? What was that? Afternoon tea? What? Australians live a different life. Phil Smith, we're making the announcement. Are we doing it? I mean,
sure,
we're going to record the intro after. So if you liked the episode, guess what? Phil Smith, I might tear up. Officially a part of the Prescript family, and with a beard like that, he's and to use the Lord of the Rings reference, he's our Gandalf. He's our wise wizard when it comes to the nutrition world. So Phil Smith, nutrition course, I think we're shooting late June, early July. Jay, you're my logistics guy on this. Yeah,
that's it.
So SportPLUS Performance on Instagram. I am a big fan of the Big Philly cheesesteak, which when I want to learn nutrition from someone, that's the goddamn handle I go for. We'll put all this stuff in the show notes, but do keep an eye out for that, guys. Phil, I had an hour-long conversation with Phil a month and a half ago.
Yeah, a month ago, yeah.
And it's fundamentally changed the way I consume food. Although I need to recalibrate, because Serbia, everyone eats cheese. I was in Serbia last weekend, and it was to the point where after eating out for 3 days in a row in Serbia, I asked the guy that I was with, I'm like, what is the average lifespan in this country that everyone eats this way? But no, man, we're really, really excited to have you on board. Stoked. And your ability to full Rain Man is... amazing. Like you hit a gear there when you were talking about like later something getting picked up later in some cycle about triglyceride storage being different. And I was like, oh, like I was looking at you and the way people look at me sometimes. I'm like, oh, I get it now. Yep. That's that guy. That guy gets it. No, so super stoked to have you on board, man. Appreciate you taking the time. Going to have an emerging ideas up as well in the Prescript Collective. If anyone has any questions, best place to reach you.
So Instagram probably is the best place to go. SportPLUS, so singular SportPLUS_performance. Instagram, shoot me a DM, ask me a question on videos. I don't post very much, which needs to change because I'm pretty shit at that, but I am always there.
Yeah, do it.
Awesome.
Ask him questions. You put up one the other day. I think more Phil rants are what the world needs, because when you talk, when you talk, people listen, because we're all just these little squares. But we are not the same. We are not the same. You are a very large human being. But no, man, to reiterate again, we appreciate you having on board. I think if it's all the same to you at some point, having some sort of recurring on this, like you said at the beginning, it's like our previous episode was one of the longer RX radio episodes. And I remember then we recorded it up in Queensland, up in Townsville.
Yeah, that's right.
And
yeah,
I
we did.
remember when we finished going like, wow, it was that long. And I'm sitting here looking at the time here going, there's no way it was been that long. So I, for my own selfish reasons, enjoy listening to you just again, put a quarter in the film machine and just sit back and enjoy the show. But yeah, would love to have you on a more recurring basis now. Appreciate everything you do and everything you continue to do. Your nutrition coaching services have obviously on my end been beneficial, but I think everyone I know now works. Everyone in the UK, you prescribe nutrition for everyone in the UK now. And then obviously we work together with some of the same guys in the pros. So it's been a hell of a lot of fun, man.
Yeah. Yeah, the UK sort of become my little thing, and I'm quite proud of the guys and girls over there. They're doing amazing things with under the barbell and just enjoying life in general.
Well, they're under good tutelage, as it were. All right, so we'll put all the stuff in the show notes, man. We really appreciate you coming to hang. We will chat soon, but the RX Radio will hopefully chat soon as well.
Beautiful. All right, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Cheers.